So I'm gonna hit that button. There we go. And then I'll kick us off. I just want to say welcome to everybody. So glad you're here. I see more people joining even as we're going right now. We're just really getting started. We expect more people as we go. We've got 46 on the line so far. If you haven't yet, go ahead and drop a hello to us, where you're from, and hey, even throw your weather in there. That's kind of what we're talking about in the chat. But we do have today a really great time set up for us on Coaching Agile Journeys as a community. I was just checking our numbers. We have 226 registrations for this. And so, Craig, you seem to be hitting a nerve with the strategy and roadmaps in context. I know I'm personally very interested in this topic. And so before we get going, and I apologize, I don't have the slides, but I will just say, you know, we are Coaching Agile Journeys. I've got Heidi, Lori, and John and myself are here. We host this community because we appreciate the community. And I know many of you have learned so much the value of having close connections in Agile. I encourage you to check out our website, coachingagiljourneys.com. If this is your first event, look there for upcoming events. We have lean coffees, open space events, all kinds of events. Look at them there. We do see, we were just noting a second ago, several of you are regulars that we've seen in previous calls. We just thank you so much for connecting with us. And I'll just say this too, if you connect with us on LinkedIn or send us an email through our website, if there's anything we can do to serve you or the community better, if you have any ideas or suggestions, we're wide open to them. Every year we do a poll and try to get better. So please feel free to help give us feedback so we can just keep improving as a group. So our speaker today is Craig Cockburn. He's joining us from across the pond, as we like to say. We have some pretty good content lined up. We do have a couple of polls for you. So as you're joining, he's going to pause a few times and ask some questions. What we'll do for questions is we'll gather them in the chat as we go. If you have something pressing, just put it out there in the chat, and we as a co-host will manage those questions and either bring them up right away or we'll bring them to him at the end. But Craig, we are just so excited that you could join with us and share your content. So big heartfelt thank you even before we get started, and I'll turn the ball over to you and let you have the floor, sir. So thank you for joining us today.
Okay, well, thanks for the intro. I'm just going to put my timer on so I stay roughly to a schedule. Yeah, so just to introduce myself. So I'm Craig Cockburn, and I work as a freelance Agile coach, and I'm based in Edinburgh, which is the castle behind me, and I live just in the outskirts of Edinburgh. I've been working with Agile since really about 2006. I first encountered it. Started using some Agile practices in about 2007. Initially worked as a Scrum Master. I came from a programming background myself, and then was a project manager and a program manager. Started coaching in about 2011, interspersed with Agile project management for a while, and then moved more into full-time coaching about 2 years ago. I'm quite active in the Scottish Agile community, although like everyone else, it's gone global and we've all gone online. So we host our own meetups too, and you're welcome to join them. And I also helped to set up the British Computer Society Agile Specialist Group. And they had, up until recently, had been running an annual conference called London Lean Kanban Days with some key speakers like Dan Vacanti at it. And this year, unfortunately, it couldn't happen because of COVID at the last minute, but they're looking to host Lean Agile London next year. So that's me, and I'm quite involved in the Agile world, as well as being a coach, my day job. So this talk, I first gave it last October at Lean Agile London. That was face-to-face. And I'm quite happy to do these talks online. I realise it's good for spreading the knowledge out. And also, you know, particularly the people coming here from all over the world, giving up your time. Some of you, it's very late. So I really appreciate you turning up and you know, attending. I'm quite happy to take questions. And of course, I believe this will be recorded and on your YouTube channel later. So that's me, Craig Cockburn. My surname is pronounced the same as Alistair Cockburn, who is an Agile Manifesto co-author. And we sometimes chat about that and many other things. So this is strategy maps, and it's about Agile strategy and roadmaps. So people kind of understand the context of them and making the right move. Move on to the next slide. So the audience here, actually, important to clarify that is that a lot of people think that strategy is just for senior executives, but I believe that like testing, strategy is actually for everybody. Anybody who creates strategy, reviews strategy, implements it, or can help, or even coaches at any level. So I think it's like testing, or like thinking about customers. If we think about it at all levels of the organisation, we'll get better at it, and we'll have lots of different perspectives and lots of different views, and more diversity in that strategic thinking too. So strategy matters to everybody, in particular, because when it goes wrong, it's many of us that suffer from it going wrong. So the gist of this talk, there's about 7 key parts to it. So I'll cover what strategy is, why it matters, and take you through a few examples, a complicated one first, and then through a template, a simple one with some practices, and at the end, some key takeaways. And of course, there's questions at the end, but if you've got anything really that you're struggling with, I don't want you to sit there and struggle. So by all means, put it in the questions, and note if you want to ask right away, otherwise we'll come to it at the end. There's a hashtag at the bottom, strategy maps, if you want to use that and you're on social media. Although I do notice that when we're given these online talks, there's a lot less social media interaction than there is for face-to-face events. It's just a thing. Now, this is a thing I'm also introducing my next talk, but this is the visual format of the talk, in which go from left to right, show you the intro, the problem, the solution, the proposal, and then give you a recap at the end. And this is it visually, and you'll see how this pans out as I go. But first of all, the introduction of how this came about. And it was really almost 2 years ago now. I went to talk with Roman Pichler, whose content you'll see shortly. And he talked about strategy and how it influences product roadmaps. And then from roadmaps, you get backlogs. And yeah, he was introducing strategy and why it mattered in order that you get the right roadmaps. But similarly, I also went to some Simon Wardley talks, and he talks about Wardley mapping. And a lot of that is about strategy as well. So I say, well, these things may relate to one another. I was actually working with a team at the time who found both these talks very interesting, but struggled to see the relevance to them. Because again, like a lot of people were saying, well, that's mostly for the C-suite. So initially, I took Simon Wardley's work and used a Wardley map to build a product roadmap from it. And the team went, oh, that's quite useful. I've never seen that sort of done before. And we can now see how it matters to us. But I'm not going to go into Wardley mapping too much. But then that initial blog post, and the link to that's at the end, together with some other links. That initial blog post then led me on to this to say, well, strategy is much more generic than Simon Wardley's work, because his work is often focused on value streams against technical maturity. And that's very relevant, very useful, but not everything strategic is about technical maturity. So this is a more generic concept than just Wardley mapping. And of course, I'm not putting down any of these fine gentlemen at all. If you've got a Wardley map, then of course, it's probably quite useful and contributes to this work, and they both go quite well hand in hand. If you've seen Simon Wardley's talk, this is one of his slides in which he shows the value of a map and strategy. And this is a battle from 2,500 years ago. And it is kind of contrasting with this battle of Thermopylae, the map on the left versus the typical management tactics on the right of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And then saying, well, of course, traditionally we'd use the SWOT chart, but actually the map and situational awareness is far more relevant. Now, so that's Simon Wardley's angle on this. But being from Scotland, I thought I'd chuck in the Battle of Bannockburn as another example. And this is actually more important because we won this one. So this is the actual sort of strategy, and it's really quite important here because there's a few things that spring out at me. One is that actually the army that was defeated was more than twice the size, and it was strategy that won. So even though the English army was twice the size, the Scots still won because the strategy was effective. And the other thing that's really important here is that it was only a 2-day battle. So this emphasizes to me that strategy matters, and it doesn't need to take many years. It could just take 2 days. And strategic thinking in the military is quite commonplace, even for short things, whereas in big business, we tend to just reserve talk of strategy as being big things. We talk about tactics or tactical solutions as being short-term things. But I actually think that strategy is just how you approach a problem. And interestingly, the Battle of Bannockburn was only 2 days and really had a huge effect. It led on to the declaration of Arbroath in 1320, which is said to be the inspiration for the Declaration of Independence. So it really echoes all the way down history, a bit like another 2-day event that's almost 20 years ago now, which is the Agile Manifesto. It was only 2 days as well. They met on the Sunday, they left on the Wednesday, they had the Monday and the Tuesday as 2 full days, and then amongst that, I'm sure there was a lot of skiing, beer and food. So again, in 2 days, you could really make a big difference. And that's that sort of thinking that we're needing in Agile, I think. So here's the talk. Remember that I talk about it, colours. So that's me done the intro, about the intro and how this all originated. Now we move on to the problem. But first of all, the first poll to see what people's knowledge is of strategy in your context. Because again, this helps you to see, what the data is that's out there. It's not just me talking. It's a bit of interactivity. And it also helps me to just check that I'm on target with the right sort of audience.
All right, so we've got
There's
that
60
poll
people. Wow.
open. Yeah, there's 60 people on, actually 65 participants right now. 60 people joining us plus our co-hosts. We're getting great response on the poll right now. We're at 70% voted, so we've got 42 responses. So we'll give it a few more seconds, and then we'll actually go for 1 minute, and then we'll stop that and share the results with everybody. We have about 15 seconds left, so if you haven't yet voted, go ahead and vote. I see more votes coming in, but it also seems to be slowing. So this is good. I'll just say so far in the chat, I've been very much enjoying all what you've been showing so far, but especially that view of how you structure your talk. Just in general, I've never seen anyone map a talk like that before, Craig, and I really appreciate that.
That's my second talk that I only started doing about 2 weeks ago.
That's wonderful. I'm going to use that and make sure I credit you when I do that. I've got the results up on the screen.
Okay, so it's very interesting. So 7% have no knowledge of strategy, 50% had heard about it, 33% use it sometimes. And really what we're talking about is about 45% use it regularly or most of the time. Of course, every time we do this, we might get slightly different figures, but it's interesting to see the kind of level of people that you're coming to your talks. And also just like there's some people that have only just heard about it, even though, as I said, it's probably relevant for a lot of people. I'll come on to this now in a minute, because if we go off of this, what I noticed back when I was having that discussion with the team is one of the ground rules with the team is to have a common language, because they were talking about things in Agile like outcomes. They were going to boards to get business cases reviewed and approved. They were getting knocked back because they were saying those aren't outcomes. And so we needed to really agree on a common language. So for the purposes of this talk, I do realize that sometimes different words have different meanings. So these are the words that I use in these contexts. And I think that whenever you're having a conversation in an organization, it really helps to just say, this is the language we use and this is what it means here. Otherwise, particularly if you're dealing in an international context, it can really prove to be divided by a common language type of analogy, especially in business speak, which is often quite localized in its meaning. So the important thing here about strategy is that it's coherent, meaning it really fits together and makes a level of sense. And it's contextual, meaning it's specific to you. It's not just cut and paste. And the purpose is to deliver outcomes. And the outcomes have value in realizing your vision, which is your desired future state. And tactics are simply things and your approach to how you're resolving that problem. Sometimes, and again, I've introduced this because other frameworks use different types of terminology. So a vision is realized about outcomes, but some people call that mission or objectives. And also, so progress is measured by key results, which is kind of part of the objectives and key results format that Google uses and others, which isn't actually a strategy, but it's a good way of grouping meaningful data. So first of all, a quote, culture strategy for breakfast, some myths with this particular quote, which has done the rounds around different meetups a few years. First of all, Drucker didn't actually say that. The quote is one of those, it got passed on orally down the years and adapted and then reattributed back to him. I think it started from culture beat strategy, and then culture eat strategy, and the culture eat strategy for breakfast. But allegedly, he didn't actually say that. There's no actual quote from him, and there's the sources if you want to go and check it for yourself. So this is an example of cargo cult, in which we simply copy something, attribute it to be true, and then pass it around as if it was. And because it becomes from an authoritative source, we just treat it as it's the truth. And sometimes this happens in organizations. It comes down from on high, and because it comes from an authoritative source, we believe it to be true. And I see also the Spotify model has made an appearance in the chat. And again, Spotify say there is no Spotify model, yet you can go around, and indeed there does appear to be things called the Spotify model here, there and everywhere. Now this bridge is in Scotland and looks a bit ridiculous there in the sea. It's near Belhaven in East Lothian. It is in fact in the sea, but the value of that bridge is because there's a river under it, and at low tide and at medium tide, the sea is sufficiently far out that you can walk from dry land on one side over the river underneath it to the lovely huge beach on the other side. So the bridge provides access from a car park to a big beach for most of the time, and for about a quarter of the tide it's all underwater and looks silly, but the rest of the time you can see the context and provides meaning. So sometimes things look quite ridiculous without context, and sometimes things that do look quite valuable can be quite meaningless without the right context. That's just to kind of make it real, really. Now, to talk about why strategy matters, there's 4 examples. You maybe heard them before. Kodak, Blockbuster, Nokia, Toys R Us, all haven't done very well recently, I hear, despite the fact that the businesses that they are in are still there. So obviously we still have cameras, watch films, buy phones, and thankfully buy toys. So it's not that the businesses went away, it was that the companies went away. And a lot of the time the companies went away was because of poor strategy. Many times, like, particularly Blockbuster, they got put out of business effectively by Netflix because Blockbuster's wedded to late fees and Netflix wasn't. Blockbuster didn't see Netflix as the competition. They didn't see them as a threat. They didn't see their model as a threat. And then years later, Netflix had basically eaten Blockbuster's lunch. So this is poor strategy, is the lack of strategic awareness that your biggest threat is often your competition. And therefore, I believe actually, you'll see later, I talk about actually putting your competition strategy on the same map so you can see the threat that they cause you. Therefore, you can see why your moves make sense in that context. And typically, again, this is often absent. You often just see, here's our to-do list, this is our strategy, but no context of why based on what your opponent might be doing. I just added that footnote that Nokia made respirators for 60 years, which might have been a good line of business in COVID. They could have maybe resurrected the company, but that was actually a line that Nokia had until they became pivoted to phones. I will also touch later on Brexit, because a year ago when I gave this talk, it was a hot potato, and I'm afraid it still is. Brexit is for those of you not in Britain, it's the process of Britain leaving the European Union, which we partially did in January, and we've still to go through the full ramifications of that. But it was a good example of poor strategy because there wasn't actually a strategy at all. And it was quite waterfally in its approach, as this viral tweet hints at. So the next poll is to say, how often is your strategy updated?
All right, and we've got that shared out there. So we'll give you again a minute to respond. I just got to say, I don't know if you can see the cameras while you're talking, Craig, but I'm over here. My head is bouncing up and down. The last 5 or so slides,
Yeah.
absolutely wonderful examples. I mean, so that bridge, what a great picture to get across the idea of context. I mean,
Its
that's a
nickname is the Bridge to Nowhere, but you're saying it
yes.
makes perfect sense.
Right. Well, because the minute you show it, it looks ridiculous and everyone sees it, goes, oh, that's pointless. Someone made a huge mistake. But yet, with proper context, it makes very good sense. So I
Yeah.
just love it. I just love it. I'm really enjoying what
It's
you're sharing.
also about being open-minded, really. I mean, yes.
Not making a snap judgment.
It could be art, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Agile art. There you go. We got about
So we're
five
up
seconds
to,
left for anybody. We'll give a couple more seconds. All right. I'll end the poll and here are your results.
okay, so just talking through this again, 12% said we don't have a strategy. Well, obviously that's potentially a concern there. And 25% didn't know. Well, also a concern because you don't then know if you're working to it or not. So that's 37% in the don't know or don't have ones, more than a third. And we've got, what's that, 33% is about every few years or once a year, and 30% is more than once a year. So that's broadly about a third of don't really have one or don't know, about every few years. And then more than once a year is down to 30%. So quite interesting because a lot of my experience has been going to big organizations. There's a new chief executive comes in, they try and stir things up a bit. They come up with a new strategy, a new slogan, a new logo, all those bits and pieces. And then the strategy sits in a slide deck for several years and doesn't then really get refreshed. So it's kind of not a million miles away from the reality I've seen either. So moving on. Here's some data. This came from Harvard Business Review. That 97% of 10,000 executives, a big number, so basically strategy was the most critical leadership behaviour. The link's there if you want to read it more, but again, it's re-emphasising the importance here. And we see strategic failures are covered already, that 97% say strategy is the most critical behaviour. But however, the reality, and this is the most wordy slide, so basically the summary of this is that we recognise that strategy is really important, but it's actually the biggest challenge to business agility is leadership. And really, when we say about self-organising teams, we want to empower teams and want to learn from teams to get that knowledge flowing up. But when it comes to culture change, it comes from leaders down because they set the tone, they set the example, they open the doors, and they lead by example. So we'll get a real lack of, effective leadership in agile culture change, particularly unclear changing visions, and it's a real problem, and a lot of transformations fail. This is from the Business Agility Institute report. I think there's a newer version, but the picture's not changed very much. I did summarise this in an article you can read up later. Basically, I'd gathered a lot of data from version 1, consultant groups, conferences, and basically the summary of this is, it is actually about leadership. And what I'm trying to do here is slightly address that problem through strategy in a different way by inviting more people to contribute, making it transparent and ensuring it's updated regularly. And that will help to address some of these problems. It won't solve it completely, but it will help in that area, hopefully. Same principle as having a Kanban board. It's just making the information out there and public and transparent so people can see it more readily. So again, that's me covered part 2, the summary and the issues of things getting it wrong and language. So now moving on to the meat of the talk, the solution. So this is a board that I took in PI planning, where there was a whole load of tickets, and that was us planning 3 months of work. But again, you've got to have some sense to that to say, well, how do we organise that content? It's useful, but where do you start? Touch briefly on SAFE. Not that I'm pro or against SAFE. I just bring it in here because it's got a lot more content out there than other frameworks. It's got a massively rich website and literature, and aims itself very much more squarely at the top level of the organisation than other frameworks. Yet it also recognises that there's a problem. This is a quote from Escape Velocity. Again, they're talking about language and cross purposes. So again, get your language out there and just try and get alignment. So I covered definitions earlier, and it also says what strategic agility is. It's about being able to change quickly. Okay, yeah, I can appreciate that's a valuable thing. But when it goes on to talk about it, basically get a wavy line with some cones. This is actually from the SAFE website. So it's like, yeah, we kind of know we didn't need to adapt, but how do we actually do that? And again, SAFE itself, despite being such a rich and deep framework, still says surprisingly little about something that's really that important. Somebody I just noted, invite the people and don't make it a silo. Well, yeah, we talk a lot about silos in Agile. A horizontal silo is a real thing, and that's the upper management. They are sometimes a silo by themselves. Silos aren't just vertical things. So last poll, so I just asked quickly, is your strategy useful in your day job? And obviously there's I don't have a strategy option for those of you who answered that question earlier.
That's such an interesting idea, Craig, the horizontal silo, because absolutely, I can't tell you how many times I've drawn the vertical silos and introduced that, but recognizing that you can absolutely create a silo, unintentionally across the top. Yeah.
So we're getting there. Actually, the numbers are not so different to before. It's around about a third saying that they're using it. Usually it might not be the same third as before. But interesting data. And again, we've got about 16% don't have one and 20% saying rarely. So that's 36%. Again, it's around about the third of not really using one, or even sometimes it's about a third as well. So moving on. It's always interesting to get this data. It's also interesting for you. You're getting this data too. I'm just going to save that. Now, so this is the bit where I end off with Roman Petra about strategy in a product-based setting. Again, he talks from a product-based background, but you can extend this out generically to other settings. This is Roman's slide in which he explains that the company vision informs the product vision, which informs the product strategy. And then at the bottom, you're seeing that vision informs the product strategy, which informs the product roadmap, which informs the product backlog. So the teams tend to work from backlogs. The product owner then sets the context on the roadmap, which is like your 6 to 12 month key goals. That's influenced by the strategy, which is intended to realize the vision. So that's the context of where strategy fits. And of course, the product strategy fits within a business strategy, which again helps to realize the company vision. So of course, that's where it is, but how do you do it? So this is the mechanism that I learned off of Simon Wardley called the strategy cycle. And this diagram, it also is similar to John Boyd's OODA loop. John Boyd was in the US Air Force between 1945 and 1975. He was a fighter pilot, I think, in Vietnam. And he was involved in the design of fighter aircraft. So he came up with a similar model. If I talk you through this, the first bit called the game purpose, this is an analogy might be chess to say, why bother doing this at all? So why do you play chess? You enjoy it, or you want to keep yourself mentally sharp, or you're just competitive, or social aspects, right? So that's the why of the why of why does it matter at all? But the other why, as I mentioned at the beginning, the two whys of strategy, the rest of it is the why of movement, and the movement is context specific. So on chess, if you're sitting there looking at a board, you need to know the layout of the pieces in order to know what the best move is next. So this is what we call landscape, climate, doctrine, and leadership. So that's the second part of the cycle. The landscape is generally the things that don't change. So you just have to work with them. So that would be like maybe the rules of chess, for instance. And the climate is the things that do change. So actually, if I use the Brexit analogy, the landscape being things that don't change much, that would be like the Conservative Party generally wanted Brexit. The Scottish National Party generally didn't want Brexit. Those things don't change much, right? But climate is things that adjust that and influence it. So that's things like there was a court case saying Parliament was prorogued illegally, the judge decided that was illegal, and then Parliament had to sit again. So that, kind of influenced this. And also, at some point, the Conservatives lost the majority, so therefore they were unable to enact what they wanted because the opposition took control of the parliamentary timetable. So that's the difference between climate and landscape. And doctrine is a set of beliefs and operating techniques that you apply within your context to then understand, what are sort of best practices out there, and therefore which are the ones that are perhaps more relevant to us. And then you decide by being the leader. And then, of course, you then keep going round this loop, because if things keep on changing, you need to then keep on re-evaluating the new landscape, the new climate, and then decide again. So it's a constant cycle, this. The why of purpose is why are we in this game at all? And the why of movement is there are so many moves we could make, we need to decide which one is best next. And this is a slightly different way of representing the same thing, which maps more to things like the different activities that happen at different stages. So the different, as with the leadership doctrine, situation, will, and purpose on the left, maps to different areas of focus at different times and the things that are going on at that particular time. But really what's often missing here is, it needs a compelling story as well as people, and also the dynamics of competitors, so you know when to act, when it's optimal. And as I said earlier, culture and strategy are not mutually exclusive. Like Drucker, you can do both, and it's better when you do both, because often people are lost in all of this and we're just coming out with to-do lists. And half the Agile manifesto value statements mention people, and sometimes that's lost. We're coming as coaches to teach Scrum and frameworks, and actually realize that half of the manifesto, despite being written by 17 software engineers, is actually about people, getting on with people. And also in Agile, it's about updating things in line with the fact that this is a complex changing landscape. Therefore, it shouldn't be a slide deck that's sits there for 5 years not being updated. A quick diversion into psychology just for a minute. This came from a Scottish psychologist, and it shows that in order for us to do the decide part, things change on the outside, the landscape changes, but things change on the inside too. Our understanding and our learning and our evolution of that and processing of the knowledge. So in order to make a decision, we need to have a firm and good understanding internally to have been able to process all these external changes. So this just basically represents, I think, 12 different aspects of evolving knowledge, which again underemphasizes the fact that strategy is often fixed, but we live in not only a fluid landscape on the outside, but a fluid place of understanding on the inside too. And it's only when you've got that level of confidence on the inside that you'll be able to act. So, talk you through now the Brexit model to show how this works. I won't dwell on this too much. The slides are a little bit wordy, but just sort of summarize that. I said already, there's a purpose. There was a purpose to Brexit. Somebody must have had a good idea about it somewhere, about the underlying motive of why or why not. We may never know, but whatever it was, there was a purpose. Here is the sort of landscape type issues that you are working with. Competing groups, people want different things. It's not a million miles away from competing product strategy, but people want different things. They are competing with one another. Brexit is changing every day, so it's an extreme example, but if it works as an extreme example, it might work with less extreme examples. So a landscape static, you just have to work with it. The climate, again, was the thing that's changing, was dynamic. There was propaganda going out, there was legal action, the government lost its majority, and so there was constant change. And the issue here is that if you asked newspapers or reporters or people with a stake in this, there'd be so much detail and so much information, it was very easy to get lost. And in all that mess of information, everybody was just really confused. Nobody had a clue what was going on. People had kind of slightly lost faith in politics. But this model shows that if you rise above that by processing the knowledge, you can actually still be predictive, even though it changes very quickly, which to me was quite a surprise. But I sort of observed this last year, and therefore I used this model in this talk. So this very complicated diagram was the inspiration for what I ended up with. and it was a sort of flowchart that represented Brexit. And there's a lot of important information in here. First of all, it shows estimated probabilities at the bottom. In other words, there's no guaranteed answers here. There's a spread of options, but it does show some things are much more likely than others. So therefore you can talk around that rather than all the fringe cases the whole time. And the other thing is that at the top, where it goes from red to green, it's a two-dimensional flowchart which shows positive outcomes, depending on the point of view, in one place and negative outcomes in the other. So it's actually representing time from the top to the bottom and positive outcomes from left to right with probabilities. And because it's a flowchart, interestingly, it shows that strategy is often non-linear. So what I mean by that is that if you were to sell a product, it might sell 1 million units or 5 million units. That's what I call linear. It just goes up and down. But here there's decisions and gates. So if you're bringing a product to market, a key thing is, does it have regulatory approval? Yes or no? If it doesn't, then you might not be able to then launch it at a trade show and therefore capitalize on that. So that's non-linear. That's a decision. It will either happen or it won't happen. And that's what this map is trying to show, that in a strategic landscape, things either happen or they don't. And then mapping what happens in those consequences, because sometimes they then merge later on. And if you see right down at the bottom right-hand corner, there's one that's got an 8% probability that comes from completely left field, literally. So again, it's sometimes showing there's actually more than one way to achieve what you want. Now, you don't need to busy yourself with the politics of Brexit here, but what I'm trying to show is that through something like this, it actually worked. So despite the strategy being absent, that map was used by the New York Times, by much of the media in the continent in Europe. It was largely ignored by the UK media because they were very partisan, but it genuinely worked, which is quite an astonishing thing. Given that the situation was changing on an almost daily basis, it predicted up to, this is from April to autumn, things with a relatively confident level of accuracy in a competing, ever-changing landscape. And the other important thing about this is that it didn't try to forecast everything. It just tried to forecast a reasonable level ahead, because beyond that it becomes too complex. So like trying to forecast the weather, it just becomes too difficult. So forecast to a reasonable horizon. So what I did was, rather than reading that, I'll just say, I just turned the map on the left and then scored the goals against outcomes. And then through that, you can then work backwards. So therefore you can come up with a plan. This plan, like a roadmap, is an example of proactive agile. You're thinking ahead to consider what could or could not happen, and therefore being prepared for different eventualities. As, you know, obviously reactive agile is useful. Something's happened, therefore we have to react to it. But proactive agile, having a plan B, is also very useful, but this helps you to understand what the plan B might be. So that's what I did, is I took the map on its side and then said, from those outcomes, how do we then work backwards to say, what do we do first? So now I'm saying, like, you know, goods at the top, your timeline goes from left to right. You can now see that, and you can now work backwards to say, well, actually, there's two good ones if you wanted a revoke. There's some that are kind of okay-ish, and there's some that are really bad. So even if you don't get quite what you want, you still want to avoid the bad ones, and you might be okay with the compromise. But really what you want to do is avoid the bad ones and aim towards the good ones. And this type of diagram helps with that. Again, it's a bit messy because it's a bit Brexity, but I simplified it down eventually. But from this, you can see that through this, I could then work out on the left what the strategy would then be, and the plan B, by saying, in order to get this, here's the preceding steps that must happen. And if we're unfortunate, it goes down the wrong path, that's our plan B. So this type of flowcharty approach, despite the situation changing daily, then allowed me to deduce a strategy. And sadly, the people that ignored maps like this and didn't have strategies actually ended up worst at the general election in December, and two of them lost their leaders. So the two parties, Labour and the Liberal Democrats, that apparently had no strategy or were excessively over-optimistic, which is a massive risk, they both lost, and they lost the leaders too. So as an example of just putting blind faith in an outcome without actually a coherent plan to support it. So to simplify that down to something that's a bit more relevant and useful, I said you look at the outcomes and you work backwards to get your roadmap. And you also look potentially at what your opponents are trying to do. Therefore, you can see your moves in context. And then the points here, the sort of puddle marks, that's kind of like the roadmap things that are borrowed from Open Picture. That's when you would update things, because by that point, things have changed. So this is not static. You would update this every time Scrum obviously updates in a cadence, because it's a cadence-based framework. But here, this is event-driven. So when one of these events happens, that's the time to then reevaluate. You might also want to be reevaluating on a cadence as well, but you have to at least reevaluate at each of these major events, because things will have changed that you couldn't have foreseen originally. So this is how this scored. I did this talk last October before Brexit had happened, and every part of this diagram was accurate and predicted things successfully to a realistic horizon, and the data is all there on Twitter, and you can look back. So this is the sort of thing that I went, this really matters. It actually works. So how do we then take this down to an agile way? So that's the kind of proposed solution which I've just covered and recapped on. Now I'll take you through a couple of examples of how you can use it yourselves, applying this approach. So this is the template that I then came up with. So you can see again, you've got time going from the left to the right. You've got more advantageous positions at the top. And you've got a summary of your context on the left. So you've not lost sight of that. So you can see why we're doing these moves and what's our context that we have to work with to start from. Therefore, it's avoid and cut and paste. On the right-hand side, you've got the things you're trying to aim towards, which is your outcomes in green, which support the vision. So again, you can check your outcomes support your vision. And then at the bottom as well, if it's relevant, you've got unfavorable outcomes, you want to avoid them, and in support of your competitor's vision. So you again want to maybe visualize what your opponent's trying to do, so you avoid them, because I mean, like Blockbuster and Netflix, they were wanting to put each other out of business. So trying to visualize what your opponent's going to do matters. Now the 5 bits in the middle, if you think of this as it's like a football pitch, the middle is just the middle of the pitch. The tactical advantage is the advantage of you playing in your opponent's half, right? It is an advantage, right? And it's very useful because you can score from there, but it doesn't win you the game. The top one is you having scored a goal. That very much contributes to winning the game, unless of course your opponent scores more, but it's in support of an outcome. So this is important because advantage is non-linear. So when you score that goal, it's worth a lot more than just playing in your opponent's half. That's just an internal advantage. So the analogy, like with an organization, is that the tactical advantage is stuff that's internal. So SAFE would call them enablers. They're very useful, right? They get you advantage, but they don't actually win you more customers necessarily until you say deploy a product. If you deploy a product, that's an embedded win, because that gives you things like first mover advantage, right? It then sets the marketplace for everyone else to then work around. It makes you money, whereas internal things, much less so. And the other critical key thing is that when you deploy a product, it's no longer a secret. Your opponent can see it, disassemble it, build it, and then build their own one. In much the same way as Apple was first with the iPad and iPhone, other people then copied them, right? So this is the difference between an internal advantage, which is very useful to you, and an external advantage, which actually contributes to your outcomes, but could be copied. And again, at the bottom is the opposite. It's things like, you're playing from a position of disadvantage, and also what your competitors might do. To make that real, this is roughly where things should go. You visualize you've got a problem to solve on the left in the here and now, and you want to get to the advantageous position in the future, which is more advantageous in the future. So that's the general trend of where you would expect something like this to be heading. So an actual example from somewhere, which will remain nameless, where I used to work, this is what they were proposing to do. The context on the left is trying to do an agile transformation. They had some old job roles like project manager. They wanted to roll out new job roles like Scrum Master and Product Owner. They then believed that that would then be embedded and all rolled out. And of course, that would perhaps be somebody's goal on their their annual plan for their job, and they've then got their bonus and their annual target. So that's all rolled out. That would be one of their goals. Then Hey Presto would be transformed, because we now got job roles and training and everything else. And they perceive that to be a favourable outcome, which of course it is. But the reality is more like that. So this is, in the organisation I was in, the email went out about, here's your new job roles, we'll be rolling these out in due course over the next few months. But there was no prep, there was no warning. And of course, what happened then is like, we're going to lose our jobs, aren't we? This is an agile transformation, and that's a proxy for losing people and cutting costs. So therefore, people were then worried about their jobs. They'd already written their training plans. They didn't have a budget for training. They were worried what the new organisational structure was going to look like and where they're going to sit. And of course, it sets in the sort of fear and distrust of, I'm not quite sure what's going on. I'm not bought into this. And then, of course, things have slowed down. Nobody really wants to be bought into that sort of an agile transformation, but it could be putting you out of work. So then you just get entrenched resistance because people speak to one another at the coffee coolers. And again, it sets that organisational tone of culture of, we don't want to do this. We're all speaking to one another as a team or as a group. And this other party or HR or they're in a different division, they're just telling us what to do. So, and then, of course, it leads to fail, which is one of the reasons why agile transformations take much longer than expected, because it's a culture transformation. And if you don't have that cultural approach, it leads to things like entrenched resistance that are then difficult to overcome. So that was the optimistic plan, and that's the reality. And you can quickly see the difference there. In terms of really, rather than waiting for it to fail, if you see that it's not going in the right direction, you should have the sensors out there to say, why is this not going the way we expect, or what's going wrong? So the reality is probably more like that, where it's things like, you've got the roles, let's now just develop a pilot group, pilot the new roles, see how that goes. That might go well, it might not go well. That might not go well, might fail. You might then expand the pilot. So this is much more like what we'd see as being an agile plan with real options. And then when you've got to each of these points, you then reevaluate and so say, like, is this plan still relevant and current? Is it working the way we want? Do we need to update it and change it? But this like visualizes failure. And by visualizing failure, you then cause people to act to avoid that failure. And this is very consistent with practices like red team thinking that I also talk about, which is things like pre-mortem by Dr. Gary Klein, which is imagining a scenario in which everything's gone wrong, and then working backwards to say, well, what would be the precursor steps? So then when you find the first step in that wrong path, you can then say, well, are we actually on that already? Because that's just the alarm bell that then wakes everybody up to stop you being the next blockbuster. Oh, we're actually on that failure path right now. Let's act now, because if we don't act, we're going to fail. The diagram shows it. So this is much more like what strategy is like in real life. Rather than a to-do list, you can actually see the context, the moves, and also it's got time in there so you see what to do first. From this in green, that's where you get your roadmap from. So that's your strategy, and that's your roadmap, and that's your plan B. So you've actually got things ready and prepared, and of course you're updating things as you go. So again, it's not just a static to-do list of goals, it's context and it's moves with plans and backup plans to show you where they would take you. So of course, if you end up with a different approach, well, yeah, it's not been quite so successful, but you've avoided failure, and you may well take longer to get it, but you're still generally not doing too bad. But that's the relationship between strategy, roadmap, and alternatives and plan B. So you've then got a roadmap for teams to work to, and the product owner's got the context of plan Bs to keep that handy just in case you need it. So there's a lot of practices around building strategies that work with this. I see this as a facilitation practice and a visualization practice to support regular reflection and transparency. There are a lot of underlying practices for strategy that are already out there. I mentioned pre-mortem already, and Cynefin as well. It influences how far you can predict. Now, people talk about agile working in the complex space, which it does generally, but that doesn't mean to say that every move is complex. Some are just complicated. You'll do this and then that will happen, right? You call a general election, and then there'll be a general election, right? That's not complex, that's just straightforward. So understanding the level of complexity for each move influences how far ahead you can plan for that move, rather than saying everything's complicated or everything's complex, everything's complex, so everything needs an experiment. If you know the Cynefin domain it sits in, that then can influence how far ahead it is relevant to plan. So there's a lot of underlying practices there to support the development of strategy. And again, having a strategy requires deep domain knowledge, which I don't have. I can come in here with a facilitation practice and some strategic practices, but to actually do strategy, like the Brexit diagram, requires a deep knowledge of politics. So you need the deep knowledge from the business to actually say, this is what the landscape and the climate's telling us here. So you then draw that out and use this type of approach in tandem with it. As I say, with Cynefin, the practices there influence the level of planning that is relevant. And complicated, that's where lean's quite relevant. So it's just like optimize what you're doing. But complex is typically the agile, but the level of complexity for each move, I suggest that each point in the strategic diagram, the strategy map, it has a level of Cynefin domain associated with it, so that then influence how far ahead you plan. So yeah, you might want to color code them to the domain if you want. It's just an extra practice. I touched on strategy maps as a concept have actually been around for a wee while. As an emeritus professor at Harvard, I guess I'm in good company, but this was a while ago. This is about 20 years ago. I think this blog from Harvard's Business Review in 2000. So clearly with Cynefin and Agile, thinking has moved on a lot since then. And this is a much more balanced scorecard, which was quite useful in the day. But as I say, that I've just put out there in case you encounter the term, to show that, you know, with modern thinking, I'm not trying to put that sort of thinking down at all, but that's just a reflection of where leadership was at then. So that's about using it. So a quick recap is now coming up, so that if your brain's buzzing, or be able to consolidate that a little bit. Wordley maps and how they fit in. They visualize movement, which is things mature across time from genesis to product, to bespoke to product, then commodity. That's very relevant for technical maturity. Not everything's necessarily about that, but I'm just saying if you've got a Wordley map, it can influence what you're trying to do, so that you can then develop the map of how and when you propose to do it. And just say this is about a generic visualization practice. That's the link to Simon Wardley's keynote about crossing the river by feeling the stones. That's his terminology from Deng Xiaoping. But that analogy of crossing the river by feeling the stones, well, there's the river and there's the stones in this diagram. So it's actually showing you where you start from the bottom left to the top right, and how that concept that Simon Wardley uses maps to this type of thinking. It's just about assessing your way and plotting options. And this is where it all sort of comes together as the three different parts here. I see your leadership I've talked on much earlier. Agility is about responding to complexity, and lean is a different aspect, which is just about improvement. So there's three different things that I think really go together, with often leadership missed out of this, which is why we have the problems that we talked about earlier. And these are all overlapping with one another, with the circle kind of representing the sort of people aspect of this, all linking into all of it. Here's some key sort of practices, just sort of make it visible. Avoid to-do lists, just a bit of a takeaway list. Invite feedback, make it transparent, review and reflect, make it open. These are all principles we use in Agile and Kanban. But then to kind of bring it together and summarize as the obvious, the obvious biggest takeaway, here we go. So this is what this can do, which not all of these will be relevant in your context, but some of them may, and most of them might. So it's a way of perhaps saying, well, if we employed at least some of these 12 things, would we then be in a better position than we're in just now? And this is what I perceive to be the benefits. There may be others, but again, it's up to you. And again, things like just saying, what are your opponents doing and what might they do? So then you can visualize their moves, and then on your board, just to kind of see what's going on. I mentioned probability as well. That is quite hard. It was using the Brexit diagram, was quite useful. And it's useful maybe if you just did small, medium, large, or a rough idea, or you don't have to do exact probabilities, it's quite difficult. But then the pivot points, as I say, this is where your plan B comes in. And again, transparent view and people provide feedback. So that's the kind of recap of the main plus points and the link to Wardley. And then just to kind of take you to the very last bit of ongoing learning, there's some further reading and some books and some links to some blogs that I used for the research. So that's pretty much, and again, I'll send out the slide deck at the end. So we're almost up to the there's lots of further reading there if you want to go into it, including some longer articles I've written on this. And really that's the questions and feedback section, that's the summary of the talk. So you've got that as your takeaway.
Craig, that's amazing. I do have some questions that came in during the talk. I'll grab two since we're short on time. I think the one that came in that I thought would most resonate with our audience. So in a conversation about strategy, you talked at the beginning about kind of people feeling, lower level, right? I'm not at the place, I don't have that seat at the table. How can some of us who maybe aren't invited into those conversations, how would you recommend we start trying to engage in that conversation? Obviously, without having a title of a VP, some organizations say strategy's not your thing, you're the worker.
Yeah.
How can we maybe help try to elevate this conversation? Since you made such a good case for strategy here, how do you recommend we try to elevate that?
So I mean, it's difficult, but I think there's two prongs here. One is that, as I say, strategy is for everybody. And even we're doing it, but we don't actually call it strategy. So a sprint plan is your strategy for successfully executing a sprint, right? It's not just a list of JIRA tickets in order, right? It's here's 10 days. How do we organize those 10 days in the most effective way to deliver the sprint goal? That's exactly what Scrum is. It is a sprint plan is your strategy for the next fortnight to execute in a way and mobilize yourselves efficiently to deliver the sprint goal. I did a version of this for a team with that in mind, but when you start thinking strategically like this, you can then start to get that energy sort of thinking and then try to socialize that and bring that up as a way of saying, just like me working with the team, like, what's our outcomes? Yeah, but why does that matter? Why that outcome? And just keep asking why, to bring out the right sort of thinking. Now, apart from the C-suite, a lot of what goes on in organizations is by informal networks, water coolers, who knows who. And it's about just, even if you just put a few diagrams up in your office, when you're back in the office, just saying, oh, I've never seen one of those before. Let's start having a talk about this. So just having a board saying, we're doing strategy like this, and this is why it matters, and this is the value to us. Start getting like webinars, internal webinars and chapter calls and learning sessions to just get the knowledge going horizontally. And eventually it'll just, it'll permeate upwards, hopefully.
That's excellent. Thank you. That's really good.
And executives don't want to fail, right?
Yes.
If you showed the blockbuster strategy of their future to them, they would go, well, that's not the future that we want. So no executive wants to fail. And so putting it to them is saying, if you did this, you're less likely to fail. Is that not an attractive thing?
Yeah, excellent. All right, let me ask you another one. And another really good question just came in, but what is your point of view on strategy sprints? So sometimes we have these at the beginning, you do something, we're gonna take that first period of time to really lay out a strategy. Think that's useful, or do you think that should happen before you're even forming the team?
I suppose it's something that you would probably do initially before you form the team, but then reevaluate once you have the team, because then the team brings experience, and the experience then helps you to refine it. I mean, there's an error of scaling too quickly. What I've seen in organizations is just saying, well, here's the work, and then they scale up too quickly, and then they've got 50 to 100 people doing the work, then they go, oops, we're duplicating another team. So you don't want to scale too quickly, you want to scale appropriately. So thinking about what your strategy is, and then going through phases. Now, in Prince 2, which is quite a waterfall project management method, they did use stage gates, which is startup and initiation, but they've got very close parallels with DSDM, which is very much an agile method. In fact, Ari van Bekkenen was one of the co-signatories of the Agile Manifesto and represented DSDM, and they went through feasibility and foundations, which is very much similar to Prince 2. And I see this in organizations to go through one stage, which is this a good idea, validate it, develop this like a lightweight strategy, and then say, right, now we're probe it, we'll get the data, we'll scale up a bit, we'll get more specialists on board, and then you can refine the strategy. And it's a really good balance between not scaling too quickly and scaling with the right data.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, look, we're right at time, actually a minute over, but Craig, again, just as we started, I want to end by saying thank you so much. I have taken a lot away from this, and I hope that you as participants have as well. So I just want to say that we will make this recording available on coachingagilejourneys.com. Look for our previous events section, and we'll share the slides from Craig there. Again, Craig, such valuable information for people at all levels of the organization. Thank you for broadening our horizon that strategy matters no matter where you are. So heartfelt thanks from Coaching Agile Journeys, from the audience. I see some applause and some thank yous in the chat.
Okay,
so
thank
Craig,
you.
we really appreciate it.
And just to remind everybody to save the chat if you want to copy the chat, otherwise it goes when you exit Zoom.
Good idea. I'll give everyone a second to do that. Just click on the 3 dots and save the chat. I'll save a copy of it too, and maybe put it out there with the notes too. I'm glad you mentioned that, Craig. Great
okay,
links.
Thanks for hosting me, and of course the slide deck we'll send to the hosts.
Yes,
so
sir.
They can distribute that.
That's wonderful. All right, guys, we'll see you at our next event for Coaching Agile Journeys. Check out our website for times. We'll see you all then. Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.